When Reverend Rob Lee took the stage of the VMAs, or the Video Music Awards, in 2017, the crowd tilted their heads a bit. It was a glitzy event filled with some of America's most prominent stars. And there Reverend Lee stood in his collar and a pair of gray pants, looking a little earnest and a bit out of place on that shiny stage with the big lights upon him. He began by identifying himself as the great-great-great-great-nephew of General Robert E. Lee. That's when things really began to feel strange. He spoke plainly and clearly, saying that he was there to denounce his distant ancestor for his promotion of the enslavement of black bodies in this country. He was then joined by Heather Heyer's mother, who spoke about Charlottesville and called with Reverend Lee upon all listening to work to end racism, or as Reverend Lee put it, America's great sin. Compare Reverend Lee's public statement to the reaction of Ben Affleck, who participated in the show Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates. Has anyone seen this show? Mm-hmm. Yeah. When Affleck discovered that his great-great-grandfather had owned 25 slaves, he promptly moved to have the segment deleted and refused to allow it to be aired. After this controversy made it to the public papers, Affleck later went back on his request, and the segment aired. I suppose for anyone who's done genealogical research, there's often the worry at some point about what you might find. And for those of us with no knowledge of our distant relatives like myself, I know that the results of a 23andMe or an Ancestry.com test can leave you a little restless. I know when I did my own genetic results, I just kept thinking, don't let me find out that I am related to some high-profile politicians. I'm not going to tell you who. And yes, we each know logically that whether our relatives are genetically related to us or not is not the ultimate predictor of our character. But try finding out that, say, Jeffrey Dahmer is your cousin, and tell me how you feel. Maybe it's the influence of Puritanism in this country that encourages us to search for perfect ancestors and a, quote, clean history. I've done many a memorial service where I've officiated, and I'm sure you've been to these memorial services too, where it's pretty darn clear that the truth of the person who has died is definitely not being told. There are ways we talk about or around such moments, where the eulogy might include a note that they had a very strong personality, that they were tireless in their efforts, and that you always knew what they were thinking. What I want to talk about this day is what we do with our ancestors who are, it turns out, less than perfect. And moreover, those who gift us a legacy both of brilliance and burden, to quote Reverend Emily from last week. Do we ignore their failings? Do we throw these ancestors out for their errors and erase them from our history books? Consider Thomas Jefferson. I was in the Southeast District of the Unitarian Universalist Association when the then named Thomas Jefferson District went through the process of trying to change its name. I was new to the area, and so when I attended our first district gathering, I didn't know that I was entering 3 years into a battle to take Thomas Jefferson's name out of the district. And it was a little like going to a community event or a family gathering where you walk into a room and there's just been a horrific fight that you missed. You know that feeling? Like you walk into the room and you think, something isn't right here. I should have been clued in when the entire opening worship for that annual gathering of the district was about respecting one another and speaking to one another with compassion. That's always a clue that we haven't been respecting one another and treating one another with compassion. As I looked out the agenda for the day, I saw a vote to change the name of the district, and I thought it was pretty innocuous. I almost walked out of the room to take a phone call. Instead, I decided to stay in, and pretty soon I saw that as soon as the moderator said that the vote was about to begin, people began lining up at pro and con mics. They obviously had a lot to say. I listened for well over an hour to both sides of the debate. On one side, people urged us not to simply erase our history and take away Thomas Jefferson's name as a way of atoning for our history, to think that this act would somehow make us all okay. On the other side, I heard about the painful history of entering into a denomination where Thomas Jefferson's name was not only lifted up, but placed as the name on a district which included the state where his ancestors through Sally Heming were part of our communities. And what it meant for them to again and again receive newsletters and notices from the Thomas Jefferson district. On the other side, I heard about how it was wrong to simply throw an ancestor out, and that we owed Thomas Jefferson a great deal and we should respect him, one after another, and the rhetoric began to increase as the meeting went on. Some said that we were just trying to dump Jefferson's name and thereby absolve ourselves of any responsibility so that we could claim forgiveness. Others said removing his name was an important act toward alignment with our values. What do we even make of the song we sang just a moment ago? Where do we come from? The words of that song are taken from the painter Gauguin. Do you know this? A painting that was the title he gave to the painting, the words that we just sang. Not the world's shortest title to a painting, but nonetheless. Gauguin, a figure who we know hurt children, whose words now we sing. Do we rid ourselves of the stories of the fame of our ancestors because of their failings? Is it most respectful to just omit that part of the truth? Do we ignore the awful for the excellent? In a faith that is often a chosen faith for the first or second generation, we might come to this place with the hope that at last we have found spiritual ancestry perfection. Hoping that we've always been the good guys, the moral superiors. But take a trip down history lane and you realize that as Unitarian Universalists, we are complex as any religious tradition. I just returned from Barot, Transylvania, visiting our partner church. It's why I'm wearing the stole I am today. It's part of their work and it was a gift from our partner congregation. Barot is a place, and Transylvania is a place where Unitarianism is steeped in history and tradition that we long for here in the United States. We learned about the symbology present in the Unitarian churches, about the color Unitarian blue. I'm going to see if we can get that through Sherman Williams. About the various regimes that have taken over Transylvania and where our faith siblings fall throughout that history and how they've had to adapt. Near the end of our time, we spent a whole day in Brasov, a city that's nearby, basically, to the smaller town of Barot, where our partner church is. We went on a 5-mile tour of the city, led by a Unitarian minister who took us through a veritable march of history, if you will. And our last stop was the Unitarian Church there. So imagine we've been walking for hours and hours. Some of you don't have to imagine because you were there. I'm looking at Joan right now. And we sat in these small pews, I think honestly feeling a little tired. Is that fair? And that was the moment when I heard the translator say, so this church, the Unitarian Church we were sitting in, is the only example of Nazi architecture in this area. What? I leaned over to one of our church members, Donna, and gave her the, did he just say Nazi? Look. Back in Baroque, over a late night debrief, we all shared our surprised reaction that this would be part of the tour that anyone would share, particularly the end note, but that's another piece. In the United States, I would find it hard to believe that we would include such a detail. But then, of course, Michelle Blanchard reminded me gently that we have no trouble driving Volkswagen Bugs in the United States. Fair enough. But we don't talk about it here. For a long time, I thought perhaps it's our responsibility to forgive our ancestors or to honor their legacy by omitting the details. But I no longer believe this. I don't believe it's our role to forgive our ancestors, for we are not the ones so often directly and greatly harmed by their actions. Instead, I think, we are called to tell the truth of their lives so that there is a way forward. Not to be swallowed up by their inadequacies or squashed by the insurmountable expectations of living in their shadow, but to tell the truth so that we can collectively find a way forward. I learned this from our partners in Transylvania. This is no small task. To tell the truth not out of vengeance or spite, not out of one last dig or word, but also not out of a false respect of a one-dimensional life. Instead, to tell the truth in a way that honors our collective worth and dignity, that believes in who we can be when the truth is told. The trouble is when we gloss over these histories and we bury the fullness of who someone was, we give their worst mistakes, their greatest sins, far more power in our lives and in the lives of those who will follow us. Compare the re-education that occurred in Germany after the Holocaust with the time of Reconstruction after emancipation in the United States. In one country, now they are welcoming refugees from Syria and become an international force against fascism. In another, we see the rise of white nationalism, even spoken by our president. Histories and ancestors that are not held to their full account of truth gain power. This occurs in the personal, too. I've watched the difference in my own family, where on one side, alcoholism of our ancestors was openly shared, and it gifted the subsequent generations a way forward past the grip of addiction. On the other side of my family, it wasn't discussed except in passing jokes and stories, and so the descendants found themselves repeating the pain and patterns of our ancestors. When we tell the truth, we also learn that our categories of who we think ourselves to be are just insufficient projections. With the case of Thomas Jefferson, we Unitarian Universalists learned that while we were telling the story of Jefferson with great pride, it emerged that one of Jefferson's descendants, through Sally Hemings, was also connected to our faith. And their story was not part of the vibrancy of our tradition because of the choice we were making. Without telling the truth of Jefferson, we would not have learned the robust voices that existed in our tradition. I remember when the congregation I served created a satellite outside of the main city of Charlotte, North Carolina. We landed in Salisbury, North Carolina, which is a small town about 45 minutes north of Charlotte. The only faith community there that would rent space to, you know what, was a small synagogue. After a couple of months, our religious education began to outgrow that building, and we realized that we were going to need more space, but we didn't want to leave because we knew that to leave would be to go where? There was a Presbyterian church right next door, and we kept, week after week, hemming and wondering, could we ask them? Would they open their doors? They had a small building right next to the synagogue that was perfect for religious education. We finally got up the courage, and after some changes in the agreement, they agreed to rent to us. It was monumental. The name of the church was John Calvin Presbyterian. And every year they had a big celebration celebrating Reformation Sunday. It was a big day where they hailed the vision of John Calvin to stand up to the Roman Catholic Church, not unlike how we revere Thomas Jefferson. All sorts of wonderful foods were prepared for a community potluck, and they even had the opportunity where you could dress up like John Calvin and have your photo taken. It was our first year with them when a relationship felt so tender and fragile. And it was in that first year when their minister invited us to join them. Would you join us, she said, with real excitement for Reformation Sunday? You can dress up like John Calvin. I'm not sure. Oh, why not? Asked the minister. She repeated the opportunity to even put on Calvin's hat. I debated whether or not to tell her that our own Unitarian ancestor, Michael Servetus, was essentially convicted of heresy by Calvin, and because of this decision, burned at the stake. To tell the truth or not to tell the truth? Well, it's not really a big deal, I began. But there's this little detail of John Calvin. We have an ancestor, a Unitarian ancestor, who was actually an anti-Trinitarian. Funny story, they didn't call them Unitarians back then. I went through a detailed theological history, and she looked more and more confused. And then I finally got to it. It's really not a big deal, but John Calvin kind of convicted him of heresy and, might have burned him at the stake. And so it'd be a little awkward, I think. We both stood in the space outside between the synagogue and her congregation, staring at the ginormous, it felt, sign, John Calvin Presbyterian Church. And she looked at me and said, well, that's awkward. I drew in a breath thinking, well, why can't you just shut up about these things, Robin? Then the minister looked at me. So maybe we should talk about that at one of our community potlucks. Oh, I guess we could do that, I said. So it's definitely a no, though, right, for Reformation Day pictures? Too soon, I said. 500 years too soon. I imagined our spiritual ancestors in that moment, about our shoulders, watching us a continent away. Their dreams, their failings, their longings, their accomplishments. Watching us standing there beside one another, telling the truth. We can't ever undo what our ancestors have done or make it right, really, any more than we can claim credit for their triumphs. But I think if an atonement in the Jewish concept of being at one is to be possible, then it must be built on telling the truth beneath the floorboards. On telling the truth in our own beings instead of managing the ghost. In telling the truth that gives our communities and our families the possibility of doing differently and perhaps even better than what came before. In telling the truth to bring healing. I was reminded this week of the words of Reverend Nancy Schaefer by the UUMA intern Sana Sahid, and I share these with you now. It's from her poem titled Mending. How shall we mend you, sweet soul? What shall we use? And how is it in the first place you've come to be torn? Come sit. Come, tell me. We will find a way to mend you. May it be so. Amen.